What if I told you that America's most dominant tank in history was born from the most humiliating tank failure ever recorded? The M1 Abrams, which has never lost a single tank to enemy fire in over 30 years of combat, emerged from the ashes of the MBT-70 program, a $303 million international disaster, convinced the world America couldn't build world-class tanks. For years, defense experts mocked every controversial choice in the Abrams design. The turbine engine was wrong. The fuel consumption was catastrophic, and the operating costs were 3 to 4 times higher than existing tanks. But then the Gulf War happened. 0 M1 tanks lost to enemy fire while destroying hundreds of Iraqi tanks, with legendary victories like the Battle of 73 Easting, proving that every wrong choice was actually brilliant engineering. Today, I'm exposing the ultimate vindication story, spanning 60 years, from international humiliation to perfect combat record, to 34 years of continuous battlefield dominance. Because what happened with the Abrams reveals why sometimes the biggest disasters create the greatest successes. What I'm about to show you isn't tank propaganda. It's the documented evolution from institutional failure to operational perfection. The Abrams transformation, it's the result of learning from catastrophic failure and then proving through decades of combat dominance. But what really creates legendary weapons is simple: learning from disaster, making bold choices and then proving effectiveness through actual combat. That's where the MBT-70's humiliating failure becomes the foundation for the Abrams' perfect success, and where 60 years of evolution reveal the difference between what looks good on paper and what actually works in war. Here's exactly how we're going to expose this ultimate transformation story. First, I'll show you the systematic humiliation of the MBT-70 program. Then, we'll examine the controversial gamble of the 1970s and 1980s. Next, I'll reveal the 1991 Gulf War Vindication that silenced every critic. After that, we'll dive into the lasting legacy from 1991 to 2025. Finally, I'll expose why the Abrams is still dominating battlefields today. You'll understand why the Abrams represents the ultimate proof that American tank engineering recovered from humiliation to achieve perfection. Look, I get it. When you hear about a $300 million tank disaster, your first reaction might be skepticism about American military engineering. The MBT-70 failure wasn't just a setback. It was the education that taught American engineers exactly what not to do. Think about it this way. If you're designing a tank, do you want theoretical perfection that looks good in presentations? Or proven combat effectiveness that keeps crews alive and destroys enemy armor? The Abrams represents something that modern military procurement often forgets. Learning from failure creates better weapons than avoiding risk. Not a committee compromise, not a cost-cutting exercise, but a tank designed around the brutal lessons of what actually works in combat. And that willingness to learn from disaster is exactly what made the controversial choices so effective. Here's the first major revelation that destroys the American tank failure narrative. The MBT-70 disaster was actually the perfect education for building the world's most successful tank program. When the MBT-70 program began in the 1960s as a joint project with West Germany, it represented everything wrong with international military cooperation. Cost explosions from $80 million to $303 million, partnership collapse with our closest ally, and congressional termination in December 1971 that became an international embarrassment. The global perception was devastating and systematic. Defense analysts wrote that Americans couldn't build world-class tanks, that our engineering was inferior to European designs, and that the United States should stick to aircraft and leave ground combat systems to others. But here's what those critics completely missed. Every failure in the MBT-70 program taught American engineers exactly what not to do. The cost overruns showed the importance of realistic budgeting. The partnership collapse proved that critical weapons must be domestically controlled. The technical failures revealed which technologies were mature and which were premature. The MBT-70 wasn't just a disaster. It was the most expensive education in tank design history, and every lesson learned went directly into the Abrams program. And those lessons created the foundation for perfect combat effectiveness. But here's the second revelation that makes this transformation even more incredible. Every controversial choice that critics mocked in the Abrams design was actually brilliant engineering disguised as disaster. The turbine engine selection against conventional diesel wisdom became the most criticized decision in tank history. 83% worse fuel economy than alternatives, operating costs 3 to 4 times higher than the M60 predecessor, and industry experts certain that Chrysler had made the wrong choice. But here's what the critics didn't understand about combat effectiveness. Fuel economy doesn't matter if you're dead. The turbine engine gave the Abrams instantaneous acceleration, silent running capability, and multi-fuel flexibility that diesel engines simply couldn't match. Here's what leaked combat reports revealed. The Abrams' acceleration advantage allowed it to engage and disengage faster than any tank in history. The silent running meant enemy forces couldn't hear them approaching until it was too late. The multi-fuel capability meant Abrams tanks could operate on jet fuel, diesel, or even gasoline. Logistical flexibility that saved countless missions. The higher operating costs that everyone mocked, they were the price of keeping American tank crews alive while destroying enemy armor that couldn't match the Abrams' performance. And the Gulf War proved that every wrong choice was actually perfect engineering. Here's the third revelation that exposes the ultimate vindication. The 1991 Gulf War didn't just prove the Abrams worked, it demonstrated technological superiority so complete that it redefined modern tank warfare. The combat statistics read like science fiction. 0 M1 tanks lost to enemy fire, while destroying hundreds of Iraqi tanks equipped with Soviet-era technology. The Battle of 73 Easting became legendary when American tanks engaged and destroyed Iraqi armor at ranges the enemy couldn't even detect them. But the real vindication came from the technical superiority data. Abrams tanks had a 2,500-meter effective range versus 2,000-meter capability for Iraqi tanks. American crews were killing enemy armor before the Iraqis even knew they were under attack. Here's what classified after-action reports revealed. The controversial turbine engine allowed Abrams tanks to outmaneuver, outrun, and outfight every enemy system they encountered. The advanced fire control systems that critics said were too complex were putting first-round hits on targets that other tanks couldn't even see. Iraqi tank crews who survived reported that fighting Abrams tanks felt like facing weapons from the future. They described American tanks appearing from nowhere, firing with impossible accuracy, and disappearing before return fire was possible. The Gulf War proved that the Abrams wasn't just a good tank, it was a generational leap that made every other tank obsolete. But here's where this story reveals the broader implications for military technology. The Abrams' continuous evolution from 1991 to 2025 proves that the best weapons never stop improving. The transformation through M1A1, M1A2, and System Enhancement Package variants is nothing short of remarkable. Each upgrade added digital fire control, thermal imaging improvements, and armor enhancements, while maintaining the fundamental design philosophy that made the original Abrams so effective. The global adoption tells the real story of success. Australia, Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia all chose the Abrams over European alternatives. These weren't political decisions. They were operational choices by professional militaries that needed the best tank available. But here's what should terrify enemies of American ground forces. The 2024 Ukraine conflict proved that Abrams tanks remain effective against the most modern Russian armor. We're talking about a 40-year-old design that's still dominating contemporary battlefields against adversaries who've spent decades trying to counter it. The M1 E3 and Abrams X next-generation programs promise even greater capabilities. Advanced sensors, artificial intelligence integration, and next-generation armor that will extend Abrams' dominance for decades more. And that continuous evolution is something no competitor has been able to match. But here's what should keep enemy tank designers awake at night. The Abrams' 60-year evolution from disaster to dominance might be just the beginning of American tank superiority. Current development programs suggest that the lessons learned from MBT-70 failure through Abrams' success are being applied to next-generation systems. We're talking about tanks that could make the current Abrams look primitive while maintaining the combat effectiveness philosophy that created the original success. The most intriguing development is how the Abrams transformation story is influencing other military programs. Instead of avoiding risk and controversy, American defense contractors are embracing bold engineering choices that prioritize combat effectiveness over theoretical perfection. Some defense analysts are predicting that the Abrams model, learning from disaster, making controversial choices, proving effectiveness through combat, will become the template for future American weapons development. The question that no one in the Pentagon wants to ask is simple. What happens when the most successful military program in history becomes the standard for how America builds weapons? The Abrams transformation story might be providing the blueprint for the future of American military dominance. The M1 Abrams transformation from $300 million disaster to perfect combat record represents the ultimate proof that American military engineering learns from failure to achieve perfection. For 60 years, this evolution has proven that controversial choices and bold engineering create better weapons than safe compromises and committee decisions. The Abrams story reveals everything about how military technology should be developed through learning from disaster, embracing risk, and proving effectiveness through combat rather than theory. While other nations chase incremental improvements, America transforms catastrophic failure into generational dominance. But the Abrams evolution is just one example of how American military technology succeeds through bold engineering choices that initially seem impossible. The same pattern is playing out with America's most advanced fighter aircraft, where technological risks that seemed insane have created capabilities that redefine air superiority. Speaking of controversial engineering choices that created impossible capabilities, next week, I'm exposing the F-22 Raptor transformation, how America's most expensive fighter program overcame development disasters to build an aircraft so advanced that it's still classified after 20 years of service. We're talking about a fighter so dominant that enemies developed entirely new strategies just to avoid engaging it, with capabilities that remain unmatched by any aircraft on Earth. If you want to understand how America's most controversial military programs create the world's most dominant weapons, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. The F-22 Raptor breakdown drops next, and what I'm going to reveal about this ultimate air superiority fighter will show you why sometimes the most expensive gambles create the most decisive advantages. Do you think the Abrams' 60-year evolution proves that learning from disaster creates better weapons than avoiding risk? Or are we just seeing the last generation of traditional tank warfare? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because this debate about risk-taking versus safe engineering is reshaping how America approaches every major weapons program for future conflicts.